said, I'm going to give you the doctrine of salvation. I call it the big three. I said, here it is. The pen represents you, and my thumb holding you down is you being a slave to sin. And what it means in the Bible that you're dead means you are unable to get out. You and I were born sinners. We don't become sinners because we did something bad. We do something bad because we were born that way. See, the government hasn't figured that out. They think if you give them a little better environment and, nicer surroundings that they'll act better. No, people act wickedly because they're dead. They are incapable of not sinning. We can't stop sinning. That's how we were born. And so I would hold my pen down like that, and they would watch, and I'd say, try and get it out. And they were so weak from climbing, they'd pull on it, and I'd say, okay. I said, now let me show you doctrine number 1, redemption. I said, Jesus comes down, releases the hold sin has on us, and takes us out of the prison. That's redemption. So we're still here. We're just redeemed sinners. But I said the second doctrine clicks in of salvation. First, breaking sin's hold, purchasing us out of slave market of sin. Justification is when Jesus lifts us from our condemned standing and says, I justify you. I make you righteous in my sight. That instant, by the way, this happens all, it's called the ordo salutis. It all happens all at once. Redemption, justification. That's why a Christian is a saint. The instant sin is broken and Jesus purchases them, because he justifies us. And a justified person is a saint while they're alive. You say, whoa. Yeah, you don't have to be exhumed from your grave and hauled to Rome to become a saint after 60 or 100 or 50 years. You don't have to have someone vote on it. If you're born again, the instant you call on the name of the Lord, you're redeemed and justified. But that's not the end of the story. We don't act like saints sometimes, right? And that process God has is that our position matches our behavior is called sanctification. So the God who releases us from the hold of sin and justifies us begins to sanctify us. What's that? It's pulling us closer and closer to him. And we resist, and he pulls us closer. And we resist, and he keeps pulling us. And there's 3 levels of sanctification. There is ultimate sanctification, which means we're going to be free from the presence of sin forever in heaven, but that hasn't happened yet. There is progressive sanctification, and that's this pulling us closer and closer and closer. And then there's the doctrine of sanctification that it says in 1 Thessalonians 5:23, the very God of peace will sanctify us completely. That means God is working at every part of our life. Once he gets a hold of us, there's no part of us that he's not working on. But the progressive is he's pulling us closer and closer. So those are the 3 big doctrines of redemption. So you say, well, wait a minute. How do we get there? Let's go back to Revelation 4. I want to set the frame before we go this morning to understand how redemption fits in the grand scheme of eternity. Revelation chapter 4, that's what we're studying, the throne room of the universe. And what we did is we found when we got to chapter 4, it's focusing on worship. And what we saw is the first element, holiness, is the atmosphere of true biblical worship. That's why the only people that are going to be in heaven are the ones that are redeemed, that have been set free from sin and justified. Because the only people who can worship God are the redeemed. And so holiness is the frame we see in the first 7 verses, the atmosphere of heaven. Secondly, we saw in verse 8, 9, and 10 that true biblical worship always is in response to God's holiness. You see, the seraphim, the cherubim, what do they say in verses 8, 9, and 10? They say, holy, holy, holy. And as soon as they say that, there's a response. And all of the redeemed bow down. And by the time we get to chapter 5, verse 9, we begin singing of our Redeemer. Thirdly, look at verse 11. It's amazing, the front row of worshipers, and the third element of biblical worship is it's always focused on God. The 24 closest people to the throne of God, the 24 elders, as soon as God's holiness is declared, they fall on their faces. Why? They say, we don't want to be seen. The same reason that the cherubim cover their faces. They say, it's not about us. God, you're the focus. It's not us that's the focus. You are the focus of our worship. That's the third element. Biblical worship always is focused on God. Then, where we are this morning, verses 1 through 9 of chapter 5, true biblical worship, the fourth element is this, centers on the cross of Christ's redeeming sacrifice. Centers. You know, when you, it's really neat nowadays, when you're doing stuff online, they have these vectors where it'll show you exactly where the middle of the page is. Like if you're making, putting objects in a frame, it'll go, whoop, you're in the middle. It's telling you when you're square right on the center. Do you know what the target, the crosshairs of worship is? It centers on the redeeming work of Christ's cross. Jesus saying, it's finished. It's paid in full. I paid the price. So this morning, how do you apply that? So far, what we've done is we've just talked about a doctrine. And what you should ask yourself is, so what? So what? What does that mean? Well, because you ask that, number one, here's the first application. Redemption should always remind us of how unworthy we are of the price that Christ paid. See, the redeemed in heaven fall on their faces because they're not saying, you really got a good deal when you got me. Oh, hey, you're pretty fortunate to have gotten me. No, that attitude, that pride, that arrogance, that self-righteousness. It's kind of like the Pharisee that came to the temple and the publican was right there next to him, and the Pharisee said, God, I give you all this stuff. Aren't you glad I'm not like him? And he pointed at the publican, the sinner. And the poor publican, it says, couldn't even lift his face. He says, I'm not worthy of any mercy or grace. That's the attitude of heaven. You know what the Bible says? The Pharisee was not justified, and the sinner, the publican, was. Because redemption, number one, always reminds us we're not worthy of this. You all know John Newton, the great slave captain. Do you remember when he wrote his testimony, what he said? Think in your minds. Amazing grace, how sweet the sound that saved someone you're really fortunate to get, me. Is that what it says? Do you remember the words? That saved a what? Wretch. Now, did you know that is being dropped from hymn books? We were just singing, and can it be? And it says, for such a worm as I. Boy, that's out of the hymn books already. The publishers won't put that in. No one wants to think they're unworthy. That's why we live in an age that everybody gets a trophy. We don't want anybody left out. Everybody's a winner. And it's coming into the church. You know what the Bible says? No, there's one winner, one captain, one Lord, one Redeemer, one person that triumphed. And we are unworthy to be a part. Number one.